This week on Book Talk, our guest is Dr. Dan Wile. We're taping this show from his home in Oakland, California. We'll be talking to Dr. Wile in two parts. In part one, we're going to focus on his book, After the Honeymoon, and we're going to be talking about how that book is helpful to couples. And then in part two, we'll be talking about how the book can inform counselors and therapists who work with couples. After the Honeymoon, How Conflict Can Improve Your Relationship, is a revised book about how couples can turn their inevitable problems that occur in any relationship into opportunities for intimacy. The book's divided into 8 parts, starting with the idea of using your relationship to solve your problems and ending on a kind of optimistic note, a new way to have a relationship. Dr. Wile is a clinical psychologist. He has a private practice in Oakland, California. He's taught in several graduate programs in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he gives professional workshops throughout the United States and internationally. His other books are Couples Therapy, A Non-Traditional Approach, and After the Fight, Using Your Disagreements to Build Stronger Relationships. Dr. Wile, welcome to this week's Book Talk. Dr. Susan Johnson, an author, researcher, and co-developer of emotionally focused therapy, along with Les Greenberg, says this about your book. It's a classic book that it offers more insight into how to turn a maze of everyday conversations into a fascinating path that leads toward more intimacy and greater relationship satisfaction. Dr. Wile, your choice of this revision, kind of implies that something happens once a couple says "I do." What's your thinking about what happens to an otherwise happy couple once they say "I do"?
Well, in the stereotype, and not everybody goes through it, there's a honeymoon period where you're just infatuated and delighted with your partner, and you overlook things that later on are really going to bug you, or even see them as charming, and later on they begin to bug you. So there's going to be problems, and you could even say that forming a new relationship means having to deal with certain types of unsolvable problems, and if you that you'll be struggling with for the life of the relationship. And if you change partners, go to someone else, you'll be changing the set of problems you'll have to deal with. But there's going to be problems.
Okay, the problems are an inevitable part of any marital relationships. One of the things you talk about in the book is the idea that somehow or other marriages can solve individual personality problems or kind of fill those gaps. It sounds to me like the assumption you're making is that we don't have to be focusing on individual therapy, that we really need to be focusing on couples, and somehow or other, that in working with the marriage you can resolve personality problems. Is that true?
Yeah, now I did have something in mind in putting it that way. I was reacting to the advice often given to people. Don't go into a relationship until you've solved your own problems. And I want to say that advice is given too quickly, and that similar advice would be, well, very often a relationship is a good place in which to solve your problems, because in a relationship there's a possibility of having someone that you can really talk to in a way maybe you've never talked to anyone before, someone who can really listen to you and that you can really listen to them. Now, there's all kinds of ways in which that doesn't happen and that goes awry, but there's potentiality for that.
Okay. And so a big quest then is, to raise the bar with respect to the kind of level of intimacy we can have in a relationship.
Ironically, the glitches that occur in a relationship, the misunderstandings, the times that you get kind of moody and quiet, or the times you get kind of irritable, while they can lead to difficult fights and disengagement, they can also lead to a wonderful, intimate exchange. If you find a way to talk about them later that gets you both empathizing with what each of you had to deal with in that moment.
Yeah.
And there's a way in which after a period of silence, you can have this great conversation where you say, we had kind of a quiet evening, and I was feeling kind of bad about it. Were you too?
Mm-hmm.
And the other person would be grateful that you're bringing it up, and you have this intimate exchange, something more intimate than you would have otherwise if you didn't even have the problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's the potentiality. That's what you're always hoping for. Yes, and lots of times that doesn't happen.
Mm. Phil Callan, co-author with his wife Carolyn Callan, of When Partners Become Parents, the big life change for couples, relates most couples get stuck in negative cycles and they'd give anything to find a way out. They also say that Dan Wile provides masterful examples of how partners' negative thinking and uncontrolled emotion can transform an otherwise stuck couple into something in which they see wisdom. Well, two things come to mind, Dr. Wile, when I listen to that review or think about that review. And the first has to do with this business of patterns and negative interaction cycles. And the second is the placement of thinking and or cognition and feeling, and what role do they play in those cycles in that development. Could you talk a little bit more about this idea of patterns and what role they play, and what role you see thinking and feeling having in the way couples function?
Well, the kind of patterns I immediately think of are, one, the pattern of withdrawal, where both partners are not saying what's really on their mind or even just being quiet, and there's a kind of devitalization. Call that a withdrawn cycle. And then the obvious one of fighting, call that an adversarial cycle, where people are feeling unlistened to and they react strongly and angrily and defensively, and that's a fight that's kind of self-reinforcing, so it's a pattern in that way. Another example is pursuing and distancing, where one partner is wanting more affection or more talking or more sex, and can often get angry at the other one for not coming through with those things, and then the other one kind of backs away and becomes less and less interested in doing it and becomes an issue. Very painful kind of interaction.
Okay.
So it's, I mean, those are some of those, or maybe all of them, are almost inevitable to some extent in any relationship. There's some relationships that can avoid one or two of them. And the ideal always is there a way to take this problem and turn that into an intimate moment also?
Let me ask a follow-up question, because it sounds to me like I'm not hearing a bias between emotion and cognition in your thinking about how couples work. Am I right in that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a way in which people can be talking about thoughts in a way that's disconnected from their feelings, and a way of getting caught up in feelings that just go around in circles. But mostly I see that most things that people say are a combination of the two. And I don't want to particularly honor one over the other. What I want to do, no matter what a partner is saying, is I want to take that and make that a more intimate statement. So if it's an emotional one, if there's one with a lot of anger in it, and I'd want to make it more heartfelt, that the person could really be grateful that I restated it in that way. If the person says something that is more intellectual than they would really want, I try to help them bring more feeling into it. Okay. And the way I do that is I just say, okay, here's what I'm saying. Let me shift it around a little bit and see what you think. And then I give my version of it, which is more intimate.
That's certainly a big part of your book. That is, as I was thinking about it, is what's the role of the therapist? And you basically take a position that there's a value added when a therapist lets the couple know how you experience them. Is that true?
Yeah, well, if I'm touched by what partners are saying, and they don't seem to be as touched. I might say, I'm really touched by this. Are you touched too, or am I the only one?
Mm-hmm.
I'm wanting, I mean, I could be missing something and they straighten me out that it's really not that touching. Or I could be pointing out some implicit feeling and helping them, a positive feeling and helping them get into it more.
Okay. Judith Heths, co-author of Core Focus Family Therapy, Moving from Chaos to Clarity, says, Dan Wile shows how the very act of talking about problems in a relationship can provide the intimacy for which partners are longing. Because we know that a lot of what couples do in their fights isn't really what's on their mind. If I'm understanding it, the work is to kind of get behind the surface fight to something that's deeper. Is that a big piece of what it is couples need to understand?
Well, the way I think about that is that in a fight, people aren't listening to each other, and they're angry at each other, and they're making accusations. Oh, wait a minute, I'm going the wrong track.
That's okay.
Say that first part again.
Okay. It has to do with getting underneath the fight and whether or not...
But the first part of what you said, I wanted to react to.
Talking about the problems can provide,
Yes.
For intimacy,
Yeah.
greater intimacy.
Yeah. Well, suppose the partners are withdrawn, and or if they're angry.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there can be a way of talking with them about the anger and having them talk with each other about their distress, about what happens when they're both angry, or their distress when they're both quiet. That can be a real intimate exchange just in itself. So in that way, something that's, if people come in and they say, well, we want to get more intimacy, well, they could have a very intimate exchange about the lack of intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
If they are talking in a heartfelt way about it and end up on the same side and sort of see each partner's position. So one person could be saying, well, when you're a little bit angry at me, I kind of withdraw.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't like doing that. And I wish I didn't, and I think I shouldn't have to do that, but I'm sort of there. Then the other partner would say, well, I do come on pretty fierce, so I can kind of understand that.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish I wasn't so fierce in the way I did that. And each would be acknowledging, each would be admitting, and they could feel quite good about that exchange.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Wile. This concludes part one of a two-part series in which we've had an interview with Dr. Dan Wile. In this part, we basically focused on what it means to have greater intimacy for a couple. And in part two, what we're going to take a look at is what the book tells us about how to work with couples in a more effective kind of way. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Richard Long, and this has been a two-part series on After the Honeymoon, written by Dr. Dan Wile. Hope you'll join us for part two.